So, Karina, what have we heard so far today?
Later part of today, we've been listening to testimony from an Ontario senior bureaucrat, Mario Di Tommaso, who is the Deputy Solicitor General for Ontario. Interesting view on what happened in Ottawa. He said while he was watching it and obviously involved in conversations that he felt there was adequate and effective policing happening in Ottawa, despite the failing confidence in former Police Chief Peter Slowly. He said because the OPS, the Ottawa Police Service, was supported by the OPP and the RCMP. He had indicated in his witness statement that he saw what was happening in Ottawa as more of an inconvenience than a public safety risk. He clarified that to say that he didn't mean to understate the impact of what was going on, but he didn't seem to characterize public safety in anything other than violent crime. That's how he determined it. If that wasn't happening, it wasn't a public safety risk. So the open fires, the gasoline tanks, the threats, the harassment, that he didn't seem to characterize the same way as others might. Then came a summary of a provincial federal call in which he said he was in favor of the federal government doing something in addition to giving more resources, a possible meeting with the protesters, amend the vaccine mandate that was being protested, the one for truckers going across the border. And then there was a question, these notes show, from the National Security Advisor, Jody Thomas, where she basically asked, would the province be asking for help from the federal government if this wasn't happening in Ottawa? Would Ottawa be treated the same way, for instance, as if this was happening in Kingston? And then he was asked, by the commission lawyer, how did you interpret that? Here's what he had to say.
I thought that the federal government did have a role. At the end of the day, these protesters were in Ottawa to protest mainly the imposition of a vaccine mandate on January 15 on international truckers. They were on Parliament's doorstep. So from my perspective, the federal government did have a role to play, just like Ontario had a role to play in the provision of resources.
Now, he also insisted, despite many questions, that Ontario was very engaged, although he agrees that perhaps that the city of Ottawa did not perceive that. He could not explain why Ontario, in the form of Sylvia Jones, who was the Solicitor General at the time, was not at these tripartite meetings with the other levels of government. To many questions about phone calls and meetings, he said he wasn't aware of them, he wasn't participating in them. So it was kind of a glaring example of why people wanted to hear from Sylvia Jones and Doug Ford and not necessarily a senior bureaucrat from the government.
And so what did we hear when Alberta was the focus earlier today?
So more testy relations between the province and the federal government. We heard from Marlon DeGrand. He's the Assistant Deputy Minister of Public Security for the province. First of all, he said there were laws in the books that could have helped. He doesn't deny that, but they didn't have the resources and the capacity to enforce that. So they didn't have the officers or the tow trucks. They were able to get extra officers, but the tow trucks remained an issue. They asked the federal government whether there was something that they could do, perhaps through the Canadian Armed Forces, but they never got a formal response. The indications were that the federal government was quite hesitant about involving the military in any way. So Alberta ended up buying its own tow trucks. And eventually, as we know, with the weapons discovery, it did end up wrapping up in Coutts. But there was a testy email exchange between Bill Blair, who was the Emergency Preparedness Minister, and Rick McIver, who was the Municipal Affairs Minister for Alberta at the time, where, he keeps asking for a response on the tow trucks. And he says, Bill Blair says we've brought in the Emergencies Act, but this was on February 21st, long after Coutts had been cleared. So Rick McIver says, we received no help until after the Coutts issue was resolved, and that, disappointed to hear you say otherwise. So then, there was a further exchange where they go back and forth. And so then Bill Blair finally asks, well, to be clear, is your point that we should have invoked the Emergency Act earlier? Well, that's not, Rick McIver says, what he was saying. He says, no, you were too late and did the wrong thing. My point is saying nothing now would have been better than not telling the truth. And telling the truth is what he means is that he's basically accusing the federal government of being disingenuous about how helpful or useful or needed the Emergency Act was, especially after everything was cleared in Alberta. I do want to point out that on cross-examination, it came up, these notes from Saskatchewan in this First Ministers meeting that was held, in which it says twice from different sources that then Alberta Premier Jason Kenney said he had no quibble with the use of the Emergencies Act. He did think there were other better ways, but he didn't seem to have a big problem with the Emergencies Act, which is very different from what Jason Kenney has said in public. So definitely some interesting revelations today.
Sure. All right. Karina, thank you. The CBC's Karina Roman live in Ottawa. So what does this all mean for Canada's national security? Let's discuss with Wesley Work. He's a national security expert and a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. We reached him live in Ottawa. So Wesley, thank you for taking the time. Where do the Windsor and the Coutts border blockades fit into the larger context of this inquiry?
Well, we're at, as I'd like to kind of refer to this, we're at Act 3 of a 4-act drama in terms of the commission that's looking into the Emergencies Act. We've heard from the Ottawa side. We've heard from the Freedom Convoy organizers, in quotation marks. It was a pretty dysfunctional group. And now we've kind of zoomed out to get more detail on what was going on and how the blockades were responded to by various levels of government and law enforcement agencies in both Ontario and in Alberta, at the Ambassador Bridge, of course, at Windsor and Coutts, Alberta, in that province. We're not going to hear, apparently, about the other two border blockades that occurred in Saskatchewan and BC. And that's a bit of a puzzle, and maybe it'll feature later in the Commission's report. But nevertheless, we've zoomed out there, and I think there are a number of reflections that we can get from that testimony as a whole this week. One is just, and I think it remains unanswered and astonishing, that none of the various levels of intelligence agencies at the provincial, municipal, or federal level seem to have had any warning that the Freedom Convoy in its various forms would actually try to blockade critical infrastructure at the border, despite the fact that they were watching the Freedom Convoy take shape and travel across the country. That absence of warning, I think, speaks to problems, genuine problems with our intelligence capacity when it comes to mass protests of this kind. And then, of course, we get into all the sort of dysfunction that is part of a federal system in terms of who's responsible and who's providing resources and what's exactly to be done. For me, one of the most telling expressions, or perhaps two, but one was certainly Premier Ford's notion that the police were a bit shy about dealing with the protest, and I think that reflects a kind of gap in understanding between the Premier and law enforcement agencies about the best way to deal with mass protests. The other, frankly, and I thought it was a charming moment, was the testimony provided by the mayor of Coutts, Alberta. This is a small municipality with, I think, 249 citizens. The mayor, I think, was an extraordinary witness, and he was really just kind of trying to give us that close-in picture of what it felt like to be looking out his window in his house at the blockade unfolding and feeling increasingly frustrated that because he was at the very lowest rung of a long political ladder in terms of power, he wasn't really seeming able to kind of engage either the provincial level or the federal level to get help and to resolve that blockade, which he referred to as a matter of domestic terrorism, as far as he was concerned. So we're getting these various perspectives, and it'll be a challenge for the Commission to put them all together. The Commission is writing the first draft of the history of an important moment for Canada, which was the Freedom Convoy protests.
So how much of a threat to national security do you think all of that posed? And do you think some of these revelations, the exchanges, the fact that intelligence agencies, as you say, really didn't have any warning that this was going to happen, is that going to change our perception of national security threats and maybe put some pressure on trying to beef up that intelligence and change the dysfunction that seems to exist between the various levels of government?
I mean, Andrew, I think those are great questions. There are already indications in some of the testimony and evidence that we've seen before the Commission that some officials are certainly thinking along those lines. An interesting part of the former Ottawa police chief's testimony, that's Peter Slowly's testimony, was really to suggest that there has to be a lot more that's done to improve intelligence and make sure that whatever the federal government, national security, and intelligence agencies know is also available to local police forces of jurisdiction. And Jody Thomas had made some remarks after the Freedom Convoy was all rolled out through law enforcement use of the Emergencies Act that we really just didn't have the right sort of perception of the threat they posed. Now, Act 4 of the Emergencies Commission hearings is coming during the next 2 weeks. They've only got 2 weeks left of this public testimony and a large cast of characters to hear from. But we're going to hear that piece from the federal government, who is ultimately, of course, responsible for instituting the Emergencies Act. We'll hear from a wide range of senior officials in the federal government and from ministers and even the Prime Minister. So, I think the Commission has saved, if you like, the best for last, the most important testimony for last. They don't have much time to hear from all these people, but it'll be a dramatic Act 4.
Wesley, always good to get your insight. Thank you.